So this is something that we get asked to demonstrate for often. It's about the integration between SharePoint and Content Manager. This is an example of a presentation that we normally run through with different clients and just go through, what's out of the box, how does that work, some of the questions that they get asked or should be asking. Effectively, the integration is broken down into 4 quadrants. Thinking of the top line here, everything above here is actually in SharePoint and everything below actually gets removed from SharePoint and goes into Content Manager. Now, going through these one at a time, manage is effectively when you have a document sitting in SharePoint, the physical document, and effectively what happens is it creates a metadata record within Content Manager. It starts to manage that content, puts some active content management in place, and effectively then captures things like audit trails and what happens to that document. The document, again, is still sitting in SharePoint, but Content Manager is aware of that document. The finalize option is effectively when it's finalized in Content Manager and made read-only within SharePoint. Now, again, that goes through that process of actually saying it's finalized. You can't change any metadata in Content Manager. You can't do anything with it, and same within SharePoint. So it's now read-only. The document, though, again, because it's above this sort of horizon line here, it is still sitting within SharePoint. The 2 bottom ones, relocate and archive. This is when you actually move content and start to manage it within Content Manager and move it out of SharePoint. So relocate effectively means you move the document into Content Manager and it is now living in Content Manager and the document is deleted from SharePoint. There is nothing left sitting in SharePoint. Archive, very similar again. Finalize the content, so you're actually moving it and then actually finalizing it from a status perspective in Content Manager. Now, the SharePoint integration is pretty configurable and that becomes a bit of a problem because literally anything on this picture here can be managed with the Content Manager SharePoint integration out of the box. So things like documents, libraries, document sets, list items, folders, the whole site itself. And again, this is why it becomes quite a complex sort of challenge to actually understand what you want to manage and how you want to manage it and when you want to manage it. There's a number of high level options and considerations to think of. So default settings, so what record types are we going to manage and when are we going to manage them? Things like your site collection versus site mappings, mapping lists, content lists. So what metadata do you want to capture? What metadata do you want to expose from Content Manager into SharePoint? And then things like lifecycle management policies. So, there could be some examples where, you leave the document sitting in SharePoint 2 years after it hasn't been touched, you then move it into Content Manager. Just again, different options that you can have a bit of a think about. This is a really, really basic sort of example of site collection or an intranet homepage. And what we always often try and get customers to do or clients to do is actually understand what their SharePoint site collections look like and their architecture around SharePoint. And the reason why it's important is because in a very simple example like this, each one of these site collections, so the HR site, the sales, projects, and policies, could have, if you wanted to, different management rules from a SharePoint to Content Manager integration. Things in HR might get managed in a certain way, might have a HR record type sitting in Content Manager, and that gets managed in a certain space. Projects, as an example, might actually live in SharePoint for the life of the project, and once the project's finished, then the whole site gets fully moved into Content Manager at that point in time. So really getting an understanding of this site architecture before starting on this journey is quite critical. And then again, it allows you to make some business decisions about what the content is, how this is structured, when you want to manage it, how you want to manage it. Again, there's not really ever a one-size-fits-all approach. This is just an example of where you can start to manage things. Again, this is an option. On the left-hand side here, we have a SharePoint site with lists, items, folders, and documents. And on the right-hand side, we've got Content Manager. So you can get as specific or as granular as you want to be in this space and literally say that this one document goes to this folder in Content Manager. This folder over here goes to that folder in Content Manager. These could be in completely different separation spaces within the BCS or the classification structures, or you could pick a big bucket approach and say that this whole site's going one folder or one set of containers within Content Manager. It's just another example of the different phases when they're managed, finalized, relocating or archiving, and just what happens in relation to metadata. You'll see down here as well some options around exposing some metadata, and we'll go through this in a demo very shortly. This just goes through and shows you that there's actually documents that are effectively managed. This is their record number. It's a record type called SharePoint item. It has the container that it's going to go to. It's going to go to this classification. It's got this retention schedule. And these are the types of options that you'll see when you actually start to interact with the integration suite between the 2 products. Again, those abilities to manage, finalize, relocate, archive and some other options around management details and security as well. This is an example, and again, we'll go through this shortly, where some of this is actually metadata. You can see that it has record numbers sitting in there. And we also have the ability, again, these are all configuration options, to have SharePoint fields that trigger certain actions within Content Manager or between the two integrations. So in an example, there's a yes, no finalized option here. And if you click yes within SharePoint, it will go into Content Manager and finalize that record. Again, this could be some examples of having contracts, could be legal documents, could be whatever you wanted to do and how you wanted to manage it, that once it's complete, then we manage the document. So it can be metadata driven and be automatic, or it can be user driven and you do it at the end of a project in that space. This is just an example of showing that there again some metadata that's actually exposed. So these items are actually getting managed into Content Manager. Again, the physical document is still within SharePoint, but what we can see here is this is the container where these documents are being managed. Within the SharePoint integration, you also have the ability to expose records from Content Manager. One of the examples that I always like to use around this is actually the ability to have things like policies or guidelines or procedures that actually live in Content Manager, but they're exposed into SharePoint, and effectively they allow users and organizational staff to go to one spot to find those things. They don't have to go into Content Manager to find the latest HR policy. They literally go to the policy SharePoint page, and right there they've got all those policies. Now, again, all that content could actually be managed within Content Manager, the revisions, the versions. You could have workflows, action tracking, anything to actually update those documents. But again, the documents feel like they are actually sitting within SharePoint. Within the integration, you also have the ability to federate your search results between SharePoint and also Content Manager. So what this means in a very simple way is effectively the ability to search for something like insurance or policy and bring back and search whatever I have access to. So if Carl's logged into SharePoint and Carl's logged into Content Manager, he's effectively going to see whatever he can see within both of those systems. And what we can see here is that some of these documents are actually sitting in SharePoint. So we can go into this, find the actual document and grab it. But we can also see some of these other documents that are actually sitting in Content Manager. And what this means, again, it's actually searching both systems when I'm doing a search within the intranet. The last option is effectively, out of the box with the integration comes a number of different web parts. So web parts are like a little widget that sits within SharePoint. Again, there's a number of them there, and then you can configure some of your own. So things like assigned to me, checked out to me, created by me, registered by me, my recent containers, my recent documents, registered today, a search web part, which is this bottom one down here. And also then the ability to have a custom web part. You could have a custom web part that is literally just a string search in Content Manager, and then have the ability to show that and put that on a web page. So you could effectively have a whole page that has all these different web parts that when I log in, I'm going to see any workflows that are assigned to me. If I've got Content Manager records checked out to me, the ability to search within Content Manager from that web part and display any other sort of specific information for me. So an example that we've been using recently for a customer is a legal interface. So they're looking at having a legal portal within SharePoint, having all the documents managed behind the scenes. But this could be a good way to join both systems and let the people work in that interface that they like and still manage the content, but again, give them the best of both worlds. So once content is managed in Content Manager and removed because the case is now finalized and finished, they could literally use this search web part to find and search just their information sitting within Content Manager. It's just a very basic example, and we'll go through this a little bit as well. We've got some documents sitting here in a document library. We have some of them that are actually in a managed state, and we have some toggles between whether they're finalized or not finalized. So I've got a record number here, which is a SharePoint item. We're just going to go into Content Manager and have a bit of a look at exactly what that looks like. So here we can see that record number. We can see that there's a metadata record that has been created. Again, it's actually already been configured to where it's going to go. Again, we've preset all that up. But what we can see here is the actual SharePoint properties. There's a URL, the audit trail, if the things start to become managed, what happens with all those audit trails. And an example of all the SharePoint properties. This is an XML view, so probably going to scare a lot of people, but effectively this is all of the information that is getting captured between SharePoint and Content Manager. And again, if you wanted to get very granular, you could start to map some of these fields. So if it was a legal type as an example, and you have legal types within SharePoint, and you've got things like barristers' names or numbers or things like that, you could actually start to map that information together. Now what we're going to see here is the actual edit status is not finalized at this point. It's still sitting there as, again, it's in that first quadrant. As an example, if we go back to SharePoint, again, we can actually go in here and edit these properties of the document and go through and actually update the properties. Now what's going to happen here is we've got the finalize toggle that we talked about before. So when I actually click this and hit save, what's going to happen behind the scenes, and this won't be instant, there is a process behind the scenes that will go through and notice the changes happen, go into Content Manager and update whatever that change may be. But effectively what's going to happen behind the scenes is this is actually going to go back into Content Manager, say that it's actually finalized, and when we go back into Content Manager shortly, we'll actually see that this gets updated and the edit status has now been finalized. You can see there very quickly, just updated. Again, in a production environment, this will probably take a lot longer than a demo environment, but we can see that that's actually been finalized now. So again, the document is still not in Content Manager. We've just finalized it. All the metadata is now locked down, and we can't actually edit the document. It's been made read-only SharePoint. So another example is when you actually start to click on documents. Now we can do this one document individually, or we can do this at all documents, folders of documents. Again, I could do the whole site if we wanted to. But within the actual ribbon, once you've got the relevant SharePoint permission, you'll see a number of different options. So I've got files here, and I can actually manage these files. So I have a Content Manager drop-down, and this comes back to those options that I had before, the manage, the finalize, the relocate, and archive. Now I'm actually going to relocate this document. Now what's going to happen is it's going to come up in here, and again, I could do this to one document, I could do it to many documents. It already has this document in a managed state, so it's already aware that this document is there. It's got a metadata record sitting in Content Manager, and we'll just copy this to have a look about that in a second. It's given me where it's going to go. Again, I've preset some defaults at the site level, so we can actually go through and actually see where this is going to go, what the retention schedule is going to be. When I actually go through and click OK, now again, this is going to go off on a process, move the document, it's going to get into a queue, and effectively if we close this and go and have a bit of a look, what's going to happen if we search this record number is the actual document will start to appear. So again, the metadata record's still there because we had it, and just as it happened right then, we've physically moved that document into Content Manager. Now if we go back and have a look in SharePoint, we refresh that page, that document's now no longer sitting in this library of folders. Now again, I could have done that to one, I could have done that to many. I can also have this automatically set up. So again, based on triggers or any sort of rules, this can actually happen automatically as it goes and progresses. Here again, that's just another example of some of the metadata that's actually exposed. Again, this is just the actual document library that sits behind it. Exposing records. So we talked about it before as an example where you can expose records from Content Manager. So as an example, we've got a folder sitting in here in Content Manager. Now this folder has a number of HR documents in it. We can see that there are some documents in here, and let's pretend these are our policies and procedures. Again, all these documents live within Content Manager. And what we can actually do within the SharePoint integration is actually configure a string search, create a search, and then just convert it to string. And what we can do to this document library is we can go up to the ribbon, go down through in the settings and actually go to exposure settings. And effectively what this means is it will configure the search and some rules about what we want to expose. Now again, this could be a very simple search, just like I'm doing at the moment, a container search. It could be container, finalized records, security classification equals public. Again, you can get very granular with that example. We've got another couple of exposure options here that we want to see the latest revision. So again, there's some options here to say that you might want to only look at the OCR text, you might want to look at the native mail format, the PDF version of it, a redacted version of it, a HTML preview of it. But in this example, I want to see the latest revision of that document. We can see what the content type within SharePoint is going to map to as well. We can also go through and do a bit of a record count and a recalculate. Effectively, a record count will go and query Content Manager and come back and say there is 10 records as an example and let you know that. And a recalculate will go and do that if you needed to add more documents and do those types of things. But in this example, all I'm going to do is hit save. Now, again, already pre-configured that it's going to do recalculations on a regular interval. When we go back to SharePoint shortly, we'll actually see these documents start to populate into that SharePoint library. So again, these documents are sitting here within Content Manager, and then we go back into the exposed records. As we start to refresh, we'll start to see, oh, there's a document that's actually been brought in. It has a record number, and we can actually see that here's the title and where it's sitting. And again, as we refresh the page a couple more times, more documents will start to flow in. And again, if we go and have a look within Content Manager, there are those exact same documents. Again, they still live within Content Manager, still get updated within Content Manager, but effectively are now sitting in SharePoint so that users can view them, open them from here, do what they need to do. Again, over time, this will start to repopulate and you'll see all of the documents come back shortly. One of the other things we mentioned was search. So this is an option to actually integrate the search center within SharePoint into Content Manager. And again, this allows you to actually integrate the two worlds together. So effectively, if I was to do a search for, say, policy, as an example, do a search. Now, this is going to search for everything that I have access to within SharePoint, but also within Content Manager. Now, again, it's going to bring back different options and show me different options. And again, we can tell by configurations. And again, this can be branded and skinned and changed based on organizational needs. And most organizations will probably have a branding or an intranet that's in a different view there. And again, this will bring back these records for us to have a look at, or documents, and then allow us to view them and change them. So we can see here we've done a search for policy, and we can see that there's some HPE's Content Manager results for the word policy. And what actually happens here is, again, we can see some information about the policy. We can see the record number. So again, we could go into Content Manager, copy and paste that and have a look at it. But what actually the integration does is integrate to the web client. So I can actually click on this item and it's going to take me directly to that item within Content Manager. It's going to open up the web client and take me to that actual record sitting within Content Manager as well. Again, we can see here there's some other examples that may not actually be within Content Manager. Some of these could be sitting in SharePoint itself. So that's brought me through directly to the actual document sitting within Content Manager. And again, I can go and view that document, edit it, change it. Again, this is just a metadata record, but again, that ability to integrate and federate those two search results together. Some of the questions we always, I suppose, propose to clients when we go through these types of SharePoint Content Manager journeys is literally a number of these. So, do you actually have a strategy? So a strategy to manage content within SharePoint to Content Manager. Again, as a very quick example, we went through lots of different options, needing to know what that looks like, what you want to manage and how you want to manage it. As we got here, what content do you want to manage? There might be some examples where you've got team information and it's not relevant to managing Content Manager because it could be rosters, photos, things about let's go to coffee, whatever it may be. What site collections or specific sites do you want to manage? So again, going back to that SharePoint architecture, understanding what it looks like and what rules you want to apply. Do you have an enterprise security model that aligns with SharePoint security versus Content Manager security? What we find is there's always a very rigid, well thought out security model within Content Manager. And then when you go into SharePoint, it's a lot less structured and probably a lot more fluid. So, in a perfect world, you'd want to have, Carl's position as the general manager of Wyldlynx has this security within SharePoint and the similar security within Content Manager based on his position. If I was to leave tomorrow and someone jumps into my position, they should get all of the access that role has entitled to it. Very rarely do we see that these two worlds are actually joined. And again, that's just some of those things to consider. Do you actually want to expose content from Content Manager? So is there any content that's actually worth exposing, like those policies and procedures and things like that for the whole organization or for specific teams that we talked through? Do you want to federate your search results? Again, that example of doing a search for policy and bringing back multiple options. What is your SharePoint architecture? I think we've labored on that enough, but effectively knowing what that looks like is really key in that example. Understanding if there's any correlation between SharePoint content types and Content Manager record types. So within SharePoint, there's effectively different content types, and a content type is exactly what we have in Content Manager land, where it's a record type. And effectively, most organizations roll out, or most IT organizations roll out with just the basics, which is a document and a folder. Some organizations, though, start to think about, maybe if we capture it in SharePoint as a finance record, then we'll be able to do some searches and split them and change them. But we might have a finance record or a content type in SharePoint. It might have things like a PO number or a debtor number. Now, again, if that's the case and there's a correlating or similar field or record type in Content Manager, you've got that ability to actually map those fields. So again, reducing the amount of human entry and saying that, Carl adds a finance record type in Content Manager. He's added all these 5 fields, and when we manage that record, all 5 of those fields are going to come into Content Manager itself. What metadata would you like to map between SharePoint and Content Manager? Again, very basic example we just went through there as well, but things like authors, dates, SharePoint site items, just again, titles, where do you want to map things to and how you want to map it. So again, just an example of, asking some of these basic questions to get things rolling.